Yes, that's very important. Of course, implementation is key when we talk about climate solutions, and especially if we want to talk about transformational change. We need to get different actors involved in climate resilient action. IUCN, under the GGCA banner, has been developing groundbreaking climate change and gender action plans through multi-stakeholder processes, whereby we actually drive women's empowerment and gender equality through very practical actions that have been agreed on at the broad level, at the national level, and then can then get funded, and the projects can be taken forward in terms of getting us to a more climate resilience community.
And we're talking about 12 different countries, very, very varied countries, Costa Rica, Jordan, Egypt. Can you give me a specific example, perhaps in Egypt, where these gender action plans are being implemented? How does it apply to women on the ground?
Yes. We talk about climate change and we talk about adaptation as well as mitigation, which means we both have to address the root causes of climate change as well as adapt to the effects of those causes, of course. The gender and climate change action plans that we're involved with are very innovative. They seek to transform the way we do things. So in Egypt, for example, the women came up with a very innovative example of water taxis. We know that Cairo is quite gridlocked with transport. The system is not very functional for women. The socio-political context prohibit women from going about their day-to-day business in an effective manner. So the women came together and said that they would like to have a concession on the Nile used for public transport in the hands of women, so it's owned and operated by women themselves. The stops that transport system would actually service would be for their day-to-day business, so it would encompass things like schools, mosques and so forth, grocery stores, and so that they can have a safe environment to go about their business, but also can be respectful of the socio-political context in which they find themselves. And of course, you cut emissions by not putting them in cars. It's more time effective. There's less carbon that's being emitted in the process as well.
And you talked about contextualizing the various action plans. Obviously, the situation in many different layers is different in Costa Rica than the situation for women in Egypt. Mm-hmm. How do you go about that? How do you ensure that the women are involved in the negotiation process in building up these action plans?
Well, the methodology is set out in 4 different steps to the point where we actually get to the action plan. So we start with a very broad scoping exercise, understanding what the legislative framework is within which we will operate in that country, what the contextual framework is, the socio-political context, and from there we go on to capacity building. We want to involve women and women's organizations in particular because, of course, at the end we want to benefit women, advance women issues on the ground. So we start with the training with women and women organizations, trying to understand the linkages between gender and climate change, build their capacity so that when we get to the strategy writing workshop, which is the next tenet of the 4-step methodology, that they can meaningfully engage in the process, coming up with these actions, because quite often you find that women live climate change on a day-to-day basis, but they might not be able to converse in the same language that we do. They don't use our technology, they don't understand adaptation, mitigation, but they do understand water scarcity, what's happening with the crops on the ground and so forth. So that is the third step. And then we do a validation process. So the action plan is written by a sample of different organizations. We have government on board, we have civil society, private sector, academia is on board, and then it goes down the government structures to the local level for validation, and it comes back up. What is key is that these action plans are developed on request of governments themselves. So IUCN as a membership organization already has a standing relationship with many of the ministries of the environment. So upon their request, we assist them with developing these processes, and then they take it forward once the validation process is finished, take it up in terms of cabinet, so that it's actually a cabinet decision that then ratifies this. And the outcomes are really interesting. So for example, in Egypt, we found that the gender and climate change strategy informed the 3rd national communication under the UNFCCC, which was gender blind in the 1st and the 2nd editions. The same in Liberia, with the initial national communication, gender was taken up because of this process that has happened. Nepal is another example where this has happened. So it has very tangible outcomes, and it assists people with drawing the links between gender and climate change and how to practically go about putting those into the frameworks, which then means that it actually gets implemented.
I mean, is there any kind of obstacles, any kind of opposition specifically from men, at kind of lower levels of society who traditionally have not listened to women's voices, have not allowed women onto committees organising on a day-to-day basis? Is that an obstacle, and if so, how do you go about dealing with that?
Yeah. Prejudice is always an obstacle. Women's issues are no different. I'm a man, I talk about gender issues. IUCN as a technical and scientific organization uses gender from that perspective. We drive the gender issues from an environmental experience that we've had for over 20 years. So when we talk to a multi-stakeholder group, we don't talk necessarily about reproductive health, for example, and so forth, and reproductive rights rather. We talk about issues like climate change, disaster risk management, development issues, environmental management issues, and that hits a chord with many people, and they do understand that. Also, we've got a balanced gender team, 50-50 representation of both men and women in the team, and in a socio-political context where it could be more challenging getting certain messages across, such as in Jordan and Egypt and so forth, that definitely helps us as well. So yes, we have a lot of obstacles to overcome, but we have found in fact that the Arab League, for example, has been one of the major supporters of this process since the very beginning, and we started in 2008.